Very often, when the subject of King Henry VIII comes up, we may only think of the most influential or memorable wives. Katherine of Aragon was married to the king for 24 years, for example, and it is believed that they did love each other. Anne Boleyn, she assisted the king in turning the country on its head in relation to religion, and then she lost her own at the end of it. These are just 2 out of 6. Jane Seymour was number 3. She gave the king a son, and then came Anne of Cleves, and then Catherine Howard. But the 6th and final wife, the one who survived him, was Catherine Parr. She was a woman linked to the royal family through her mother's service to the first wife, and then she found herself married to Henry, if she wanted to be or not. But what is the story of this woman who had suffered her fair share before she had even met the king? Who was she? Catherine Parr was, as I've said, the 6th and final wife to Henry VIII. She was born in 1512 and was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal and Maud Green. Catherine had been raised in a Catholic household, but at some point in her life she turned her faith to Protestantism. Catherine had royal blood, not Tudor, but her father was a descendant of King Edward III, and as a family, the Parrs were very substantial. They were northern, and a lot of the men were knights. Catherine had 2 siblings, a brother, William, the 1st Marquess of Northampton, and a sister, the Countess of Pembroke. Catherine's father was a close companion of the king, and as such he was rewarded with wealth and responsibilities as the Sheriff of Northampton, Master of the Wards, and Comptroller of the king, as well as being the Lord of Kendal. It's also believed that as her mother Maud worked as a lady for Catherine of Aragon, that they were close friends, and Catherine was named after the Queen, and that the Queen was also her godmother. It's thought that Catherine was born into the family's townhouse in Blackfriars, and that sadly her father died when she was very young. But for Catherine this meant that she grew up very close with her mother. She was educated to a high standard, and through her learning she developed a passion for furthering herself more than anyone could have ever imagined. And this stayed with her for life. She had a natural ability in French and Latin as well as Italian, and after she married the king she started to learn Spanish. She did, however, not like sewing, and is quoted as saying to her mother that, "My hands are ordained to touch crowns and sceptres, not spindles and needles." Catherine grew up into a very clever woman, and her first marriage occurred when she was just 17 years old in 1529. She married Sir Richard Burr, a man in his 20s who, it's believed, was to have suffered with poor health. He was a trustee, or a feoffee, as it would have been called at the time, for Thomas Kiddle, and he was also a justice of the peace. Sadly, Richard Burr died in the spring of 1533, and this left Catherine a widow at around the age of 21. She then, after his death, spent a lot of time with the Dowager Lady Strickland, Catherine Neville. Neville was the widow of Catherine's cousin, Sir Walter Strickland, and they spent time together at Sizer Castle in Westmoreland, now Cumbria. The following summer, Catherine then remarried. This time she married a man called John Neville in 1534. John was the 2nd cousin of her father, and he was a kinsman of Lady Strickland. This made Catherine the 2nd woman in history of the Parr family to marry into peerage. John Neville was the 3rd Baron Latimer, and he was nearly twice Catherine's age and had 2 children from his previous marriage. He also pursued legal action into the claim of the title of the Earl of Warwick. Catherine may have been young in comparison, but with this marriage she now had a home, a title, and her husband had power and influence. But that title and influence would not help her struggles that were to come. You see, the king, after he annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, then married Anne Boleyn, and Parr's husband was a strong supporter of the Catholic Church and was opposed to the king's decisions and actions. In the October of 1536, there was the Lincolnshire Risings for the Pilgrimage of Grace, and rebels turned up to their home and threatened John Neville with violence if he didn't join their efforts to help restore the links between England and Rome. Katherine then watched as her husband was dragged away from their home, and then between the October and the following April in 1537, Katherine and her stepchildren lived in absolute fear, and they struggled to survive. It's also thought that in the January of 37, that Katherine and her stepchildren were held captive at Snape Castle in North Yorkshire. You see, the plan was to blackmail Neville, that if he didn't return, that his whole family would be killed. He did return, and managed to free his family, but the whole experience was incredibly taxing on all involved. Now, it's interesting, because there were conflicting reports which made their way to the king. If John Neville was a conspirator, then he would have lost his life for treason and left his family penniless, but if he was a prisoner, then he would be saved to live another day. The king demanded that Neville condemn the villain, aka Robert Aske, and submit to clemency. Neville did as he was told, and it is likely that Parr's brother and her uncle intervened to save his life. So there were no charges held against him, but his reputation was forever burned, and this affected Katherine greatly. So for the next 7 years, Katherine and her husband spent a lot of time in the south and spent lots of time at court. The court is where Katherine met her future 4th husband, Thomas Seymour. Katherine hadn't experienced court life before. She was used to the rural life, but here she saw the latest trends, fashion, jewellery, and even the latest religious matters. But after those 7 years in the winter of 1542, her husband's health deteriorated, and then he died sometime in 1543. This left Katherine a second-time widow, and in the will of her late husband she was left as the guardian to help her stepdaughter Margaret, and was put in charge of his affairs until his daughter came of age. She was left multiple properties, including Stowe Manor in Northamptonshire, and was also left to support his daughter. She was left a rich widow, but she faced the possibility of having to return north. Katherine is believed to have missed her husband, and as a reminder of him she kept his inscribed New Testament until her own death. Now, because Katherine's mother was friends with Catherine of Aragon, Parr felt she should try and renew that in the form of Katherine's daughter, the Princess Mary. So by the 16th of February, 1543, Katherine Parr had established herself in the household of the princess, and it was here that she then caught the attention of the king. Interestingly, Parr had struck up a romantic relationship with Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen, Jane Seymour, but the king had also proposed, and Katherine felt it was her duty to accept the king over Seymour. Seymour was then sent to Brussels to remove him from the king's court. Then Katherine's third marriage occurred when she married the king on the 12th of July 1543. She was the first Queen of England and Ireland, and she, interestingly, was the king's third wife called Katherine, and with the king she shared many ancestors. They were third cousins once removed. When Katherine became queen, she installed her former stepdaughter as a lady-in-waiting, and also gave other family members positions in her household. She was partially responsible for the reconciliation between Henry and his daughters, and she then developed a good relationship with Elizabeth and Mary, and then also Henry's son, Edward. She was slim and beautiful and was red-headed, and it was no surprise that Henry was drawn to her. She had an unimpeachable reputation, and her beliefs and spiritual nature held her apart from her predecessors, and Henry knew this. She had milk baths regularly to keep her skin soft, and her perfumes were ordered by the day after the wedding for her bedchamber at Hampton Court Palace. Katherine is seen to have been very determined to make her body and her bedchamber as enticing as she could, and although Henry is believed to have been impotent, Katherine undoubtedly took her vows to be bonaire and buxom in bed and in board. You see, it is believed that Henry was truly looking for a wife, not a nurse nor a homemaker. Henry wanted a companion for his bed and potentially wanted to create some more heirs, and someone who could carry the role of queen consort impressively. Katherine was no stranger to her duty, and having given up the man she loved to marry the king, she was full of determination to not let that sacrifice be in vain. She could engage in polite conversation and was soothing to the royal brow, and it's Katherine's determination to have a deep and meaningful connection with her husband that is attributed to being the key factor as why her life was spared in the May of 1546. But we'll come back to that in a minute. You see, Katherine was loving and optimistic as a woman and is known to have been very intelligent. And an opportunity had come her way, and so Katherine thought hard about how she could turn it to her own advantage. This strategy included developing a close relationship with the 3 royal children, and the king was centre. Henry is dubbed a tyrant, but at the heart he's thought to have been a sad and unhappy man, especially after the failed disaster of a marriage to the teenage Catherine Howard. Catherine Parr saw a man who had a need and a want for love and attention. And the circumstances made way for Catherine to establish herself quickly and as a major influence in his life. The plague was rampaging through England at the time, and it meant that Henry and Catherine were unable to enter London for around 6 months, but it also meant that it was only each other's company that occupied their time. This became the perfect foundation for their relationship, and Catherine found herself being showered in gifts and jewels and beautiful clothes. She was even entrusted to rule as regent while Henry was away in France in 1544, and he even greatly hoped to one day have children with her. The couple were similar in their interests, and both liked hunting and archery, as well as music, dancing and books. You see, Catherine was such a graceful dancer, and Henry was a cultured man who was delighted that his queen commanded respect from ambassadors. Both Catherine and Henry were committed to the 16th century belief in lifelong learning, and Catherine then began to brush up on her Latin, and in time she wrote religious books and committed her advancement to the cause of religious reforms. Then in 1545, she became the first Queen of England to publish copies of her own prayers or meditations, and these were produced by the king's printers. Her influence over Henry seemed unshakable. Then, the year 1546. This was the last full year of King Henry's life, and it was here that Catherine's position as queen came under threat. You see, as Henry's health declined, all the negative parts of his personality were amplified. The awareness of his own mortality caused him such an inner turmoil. There was a power struggle arising for the future of England, and his loyal wife, who had felt secure in her affections of her husband, and in return gave her devotion, then found herself at the centre of the struggle. Her ladies had started to become targets in the search for banned books, and an outspoken reformer, thought to have been associated with Catherine, Anne Askew, was then tortured to reveal links between herself and those who served the Queen. Anne was burnt at the stake, having revealed absolutely nothing. And even so, Catherine hastily hid many items in her own book collection. She changed locks on trunks and coffers and summoned her sick uncle to support her at this difficult time. Now, I personally believe that Henry knew of Catherine's beliefs and interests and her views right from the very word go, and John Fox also felt that he must have found them increasingly irritating, especially as she presumed to contradict him in public, and not so much the content. But Catherine had failed to provide him with a child, and time was passing them by. Henry had a tendency to get bored of his wives easily, so it is thought that this would have been a factor. Yet, whatever happened in the summer of 1546 did not destroy the marriage. Perhaps Henry did take a penitent Catherine on his knee, and it's thought he reassured her of his love. Henry seemed to have been eager to make amends by ordering all manner of jewels, pearls and precious stones, skins and stable furs for our dearest wife the Queen, but nevertheless Catherine was well aware that her position had changed, and after a second honeymoon in the autumn of that year, they parted before Christmas. Henry felt he needed to put his kingdom in order and prepare for his death. There's no evidence that Katherine ever saw him again, and her New Year's gift to Prince Edward was a portrait of herself with his father, a telling clue that she was hoping to cling on to the influence that she had once enjoyed. Then, on the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII died. Katherine hoped that she would be made regent for the boy king, but this was dashed when Edward Seymour took power. Now, after the death of Henry VIII, Katherine was known as a Queen Dowager, and as per Henry's wishes, she was to be treated as a queen as if he was still alive. She was also given an allowance of £7,000 a year, and after the coronation of her stepson, Edward, as Edward VI, she retired from court to her home, Old Manor in Chelsea. After the death of Henry, Katherine's old love, Thomas Seymour, returned to court, and she was quick to accept his proposal of marriage, and this was done in secret. You see, only 4 months had passed since the king's death, and the Regency Council would not have agreed. The marriage was not made public for several months, and when it was, it caused a small scandal. The new king and Princess Mary were not pleased, and interaction with Katherine was limited for a while. Now, interestingly, when Princess Elizabeth was 13, she went to live with Katherine, and this is where we find out the truth of Thomas Seymour's and Katherine's characters. Thomas Seymour, throughout the time when Elizabeth was residing under Katherine Parr, made a number of inappropriate early morning calls to her bedroom. They were unannounced, and it got to the point where Elizabeth would ask to be woken up beforehand so that she could hide in a bid not to be found by him. She would even seek her servants' help to do this. She would hide in cupboards or behind curtains, and Thomas would still not give in. This was Elizabeth's sad truth. Elizabeth's governess was later imprisoned in the Tower of London, as Kat Ashley had been linked to Seymour's plot to steal and seize King Edward, and it was reported from the interrogation that, if Elizabeth were up, he would bid her good morrow and ask how she did, and strike her upon the back or on the buttocks familiarly, and go forth through his lodgings, and sometimes go through to the maidens, and play with them, and so go forth. Kat Ashley a number of times witnessed Thomas Seymour's inappropriate behaviour. She did tell him off about the inappropriateness of his morning visits, and Seymour claimed he was doing nothing wrong. Katherine Parr would also bat back these accusations, and she played down Thomas's behaviour as nothing more than horseplay. Kat Ashley even caught Seymour arriving in Elizabeth's room bare-legged and in his slippers, and was caught trying to get in bed with the young girl. The servants of her household would talk and gossip, and the last thing Elizabeth wanted was the king to find out about any possible scandals. She did not want to be linked to her mother, who was accused of adultery, and she did not want to be labelled for being a harlot. When Kat did tell Katherine Parr, the woman who was supposed to be looking after Elizabeth, there were other accusations linked to her. Katherine allegedly joined her husband in the early morning inappropriateness, and was once caught restraining and holding Elizabeth while Seymour ripped the princess's morning gown. But it is possible that Elizabeth believed this was a game. In the June of 1548, Katherine Parr had then had enough of any possible behaviour between the two, and she sent Elizabeth to Cheshire to go and live with Sir Anthony and Lady Denny, after she had caught Elizabeth embracing and hugging Seymour. It is believed that Thomas Seymour may have been eyeing Elizabeth up to be his new bride if Katherine Parr had died in childbirth. And then, 3 months later, on the 5th of September 1548, Katherine Parr did die from complications from childbirth. She gave birth on August 30th, 1548, to a little girl who she named Mary. Now, while she came through the birth itself with little trouble, it soon became clear that Katherine was in dire straits. She had childbed fever. Childbed fever killed possibly as many as 1 in 4 labouring women during the Tudor era. It was an infection caused by unhygienic conditions during birth. 2 queens died from it, Elizabeth of York and Jane Seymour, despite having the best medical care money could buy them at the time. Simply washing your hands could cut down the chances of the fever by 90%, but the Tudors were unaware of that, and many died as a result. Now, despite Thomas's cruel betrayal of her, Katherine left him everything in her will, making no provisions for her little daughter. Perhaps she believed she didn't need to, because Thomas would take care of her. But Thomas soon ended up on the scaffold after making a series of bad decisions, culminating in a colossal stupid plan to force the king at gunpoint to listen to his pleas. So little Lady Mary Seymour was left an orphan and penniless. Her father's estate had been seized when he was convicted of treason. Her uncle, Seymour's brother, had been granted a fair chunk of it, but he did not want responsibility for caring for an infant. Neither did Catherine Parr's brother. So Catherine Brandon, the widow of Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, she had been Catherine Parr's best friend, and she was appointed as the unwanted child's guardian. Despite her affection for Catherine, it was a duty that she did begrudgingly. Now, when Catherine died, she died at Sudeley Castle, a home that she had shared with her husband Thomas Seymour, and it was on the grounds within the church of Sudeley that she was buried. After her death, she lay in repose at Sudeley only for a short while, before her body was wrapped in cerecloth and then placed into a lead coffin. Into the soft lead was then impressed, K.P. Here lieth Queen Katherine, wife to King Henry VIII, and the wife of the Thomas Lord of Sudeley, High Admy of England, and uncle to King Edward VI. Lady Jane Grey was the chief mourner at the funeral, which is believed to be the first Protestant service of its kind in England, and afterwards the Queen was buried within the chapel, and it was here that she lay, untouched for over 200 years. But above the ground, the church and its estates were falling into ruin, and one man's morbid curiosity then disturbed the resting place of the once Queen consort. You see, in the summer of the year 1782, a Mr. John Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, and he was expecting to discover within it only the bones of the Queen, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloths of linen, entire and uncorrupted, although it had lain there upwards of 230 years. His unwarrantable curiosity led him also to make an incision through the cerecloths which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. I was very much displeased at the forwardness of Lucas, who of his own hand opened the coffin. It would have been quite sufficient to have found it, and to then have made a report of it to Lord Rivers or myself. Now the account continued that, in the summer of the year following 1783, his lordship's business made it necessary for me and my son to be at Sudeley Castle, and on being told what had been done the year before by Lucas, I directed the earth to once more be moved to satisfy my own curiosity, and I found Lucas's account of the coffin and corpse to be just as he had represented them, with the difference that the body was then grown quite fetid, and the flesh where the incision had been made was brown and in a state of putrefaction, in consequence of the air having been let upon it. The stench of the corpse made my son quite sick whilst he copied the inscription which is on the lead of the coffin. He went through it, however, with great exactness. I afterwards decided that a stone slab should be placed over the grave to prevent any further and improper inspection. It is believed that the hair clippings, a tooth, and a swatch of fabric from the sleeve of Catherine's bridal dress were then taken at this point. Now, sadly, this was not the last time that poor Catherine would be disturbed, because then in 1792 her coffin was dug up by a group of drunkards, and they then reburied her upside down. And then 25 years later, Lord Chandos, the owner of Sudeley, then decided to move Catherine to a safer tomb, and the exhumation was done by Reverend John Lates. Lates completed repairs of the chapel, and then, on July 18th, 1817, the following notes were made by Edmund T. Brown. After considerable search, the coffin was found bottom upwards in a walled grave where it had been deposited. It was then removed to the Chandos vault, and we proceeded to examine the body. But the coffin had been so frequently opened, we found nothing but the bare skeleton, except a few pieces of cerecloth which were still under the skull, and a dark-coloured mass, which proved to contain, when washed, a small quantity of hair, which exactly corresponded with some I already had. The roots of the ivy, which you may remember grew in such profusion of the walls of the chapel, had penetrated into the coffin and completely filled the greater part of it. We then had the different pieces of lead, which from time to time had been cut from the coffin, firmly nailed together, as to present the original form of the coffin, and it was placed on 2 large flat stones by the side of that of the former Lord Chandos. Dr. Nash said, "The Queen must have been low of stature, as the lead was enclosed. Her corpse was but 5'4" in length, but 5'4" is believed was a very average height for the time, making Katherine Parr quite normal in stature." Brown concluded, the ancient chapel, which had been desecrated by the Puritans, was thoroughly renovated under the direction of Sir John Gilbert Scott, and a handsome decorated altar tomb, surmounted by a Gothic canopy, was erected on the north side to the memory of Queen Katherine Parr, whose effigy was rendered as correctly as it could be from the portraits which are extant. It was 216 years after her death that Katherine Parr was then safely under her alabaster image, and was finally able to enter into a restful eternity. Katherine Parr lived a very eventful life. She was married 4 times, with her third being the King of England, Henry VIII. She had multiple stepchildren, and sadly died just a few days after giving birth to her own child. She was a writer and a strong believer of her faith, who scarcely saved her own life, but knowing how to talk with the king. Some feel she wouldn't have been so lucky if he wasn't reaching the end of his life. She published multiple books, the most famous being her Lamentations of a Sinner, a book deemed to be heresy by the Catholic Church. Katherine has, in death, earned much respect from different historians. She was compassionate and firmly religious. She had a strong sense of loyalty and devotion, and held common sense and high moral holding. She is reported as having been strong-willed and outspoken, and very beautiful and desirable, and much like her stepdaughter, the later Elizabeth I, she was susceptible to roguish charm and was not afraid to use obscene language if the occasion suited. She died relatively young at 37 years of age, but in her life she experienced a whirlwind of events, and sadly after she died she was subjected to the most horrific of abuse in relation to her burial place and corpse, but at least now she can finally rest. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.